What if I told you that the greatest expedition of the 16th century turned into the most catastrophic disaster in the history of exploration? Are you ready to learn the truth about a journey that began with dreams of untold riches and ended as an open challenge to the world's most powerful empire?
A group of Spanish explorers set out into the impenetrable forests of the Amazon, hoping to find the legendary city of pure gold.
The legend of El Dorado was not just a fairy tale for gullible sailors. It was a carefully orchestrated geopolitical myth. The Spanish crown used this rumor to spur a constant stream of explorers deeper into the unexplored continent.
It was the perfect tool for controlling the masses in new and unstable territories.
Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how one officer's blind ambition turned a disciplined unit into an uncontrollable force that changed the course of the continent's history. I will reveal the Conquistador's best-kept secret, the one that drove them to abandon everything for a phantom goal. In the mid-16th century, the viceroyalty of Peru was in a state of deep economic and political crisis. The end of the active phase of conquest left thousands of armed men without work or a clear purpose. The vast masses of former soldiers posed a serious threat to the stability of the young colonial government. Organizing a new large-scale expedition became the ideal way to channel this explosive energy beyond the settled lands. Preparations for the expedition resembled a large-scale military operation involving colossal resources. The expedition's leader, Pedro de Ursua, invested all his savings in this project and took out enormous loans.
Arsenals were emptied to equip hundreds of men with the finest firearms and bladed weapons of the time.
Plans were made to build an entire fleet of river vessels to navigate uncharted waterways. Lope de Aguirre joined this venture as an experienced officer with a reputation as a tough enforcer. His past was filled with political intrigues, uprisings, and constant confrontation with the authorities. The participation of such a man in the expedition laid the groundwork for future conflicts within the leadership from the very beginning. However, his organizational skills and authority among the rank-and-file soldiers made him an indispensable member of the expedition. This confidence was bolstered by the stories of the guides, who tried to meet the expectations of the armed foreigners. None of the leaders realized the true scale of the Green Continent or the logistical challenges ahead. Under these conditions, the social structure of the expedition began to rapidly unravel under the pressure of circumstances. Discipline, based on promises of wealth, melted away along with the fading hope of finding the city of gold. The officers were losing their authority, and the rank-and-file members were increasingly voicing their dissatisfaction with the chosen route. Political instability within the group grew with every kilometer traveled along the endless river. Hurreau was unprepared for such a turn of events and showed weakness at a critical moment. His attempts to maintain order through persuasion and compromise only exacerbated the situation.
The resulting power vacuum was immediately filled by more decisive and radical leaders.
Lope de Aguirre watched the events closely, waiting for the right moment to take decisive action. The situation demanded an immediate resolution. Otherwise, the entire expedition risked getting lost in the Green Labyrinths forever. I'd be very interested to hear your perspective on such historical adventures from the past. What do you think of people willing to risk everything for a non-existent ideal? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the continuation of this incredible chronicle. What I'm about to show you is banned in 12 countries as an example of perfect crowd manipulation. This statement perfectly describes the methods Aguirre began to use to capture the minds of his subordinates. In the isolated confines of the ships, he began methodically building a new value system among the exhausted people. His words fell on fertile ground of total disillusionment with the official leadership of the research expedition. The Amazonian landscape played a decisive role in altering the psychology of every participant in this long voyage.
The absence of the familiar horizon and the constant movement of the water distorted their perception of time and space.
People forgot about their past, the Crown's orders, and the original purpose of the entire enterprise. The only reality was the ship's deck, the murky water over the side, and the impenetrable wall of the rainforest. Ursua's removal passed without much fuss, becoming the inevitable outcome of his numerous administrative errors. The nobleman Fernando de Guzman, a weak-willed man convenient for the conspirators, was appointed the new formal leader. Aguirre chose to remain in the shadows, taking the position of camp commander, controlling the actual armed force. This shift in roles completely altered the balance of power, transforming the exploratory mission into a political movement. The expedition officially abandoned the search for El Dorado, changing the direction of its journey forever. The new goal became reaching the Atlantic Ocean and subsequently seizing the rich Peruvian provinces. This ambitious plan required crossing the entire continent and waging a full-scale war against the Spanish crown.
A group of desperate people declared war on the most powerful empire of their time.
The change in objective required a complete restructuring of the entire command structure and a strict centralization of power. Any doubts about the new course were viewed as treason and nipped in the bud. The expedition turned into a militarized structure where personal loyalty became the only guarantee of safety. Step by step, Aguirre concentrated absolute control over resources and people's lives in his own hands. The river continued to carry them forward, but now it was a path not to wealth, but to an inevitable clash with the empire. Every day of the journey widened the gulf between the rebels and their past in the civilized world. Do you think these people could have fully grasped the depth of their political isolation? The scale of the consequences of such a move was truly devastating for every single participant. None of them could have foreseen the outcome of this long logistical disaster. Are you ready to learn exactly how Aguirre transitioned from covert manipulation to absolute dictatorship? What if everything you were taught is outdated and the laws of the old world no longer apply here? It was precisely this idea that Aguirre made the foundation of his new ideology, actively instilling it into the minds of his subordinates. He methodically dismantled all authority figures except his own, creating a vacuum of absolute obedience. In conditions of isolation, this strategy proved incredibly effective, transforming a motley crowd into a single, unified mechanism. Guzman, the nominal leader, quickly realized his true role as a puppet in the hands of a cruel puppeteer. His attempts to assert independence were quashed, and his entourage was replaced with people loyal to Aguirre.
The illusion of dual leadership was maintained solely to preserve the appearance of legitimacy for the processes unfolding within the group.
In reality, the expedition had come entirely under the direct control of the new, ruthless leader. The reorganization of the unit was accompanied by radical changes in logistics and the distribution of the remaining meager provisions. All food and weapons were confiscated and placed under the strict guard of the dictator's trusted aides. The distribution of rations became a tool for rewarding loyal soldiers and punishing those who doubted. The allocation of resources became a reliable tool for the new regime in maintaining absolute discipline. The construction of new ships capable of sailing the open ocean became the primary task for the exhausted people. Work proceeded under the harshest conditions of the tropical climate, with a constant shortage of tools and materials. Aguirre personally supervised every stage, allowing no delay or passive sabotage. The success of this construction was their only ticket out of the green labyrinth of the Great River. As they advanced toward the ocean, nature became increasingly harsh and utterly unpredictable. The river widened, turning into a vast inland sea teeming with treacherous currents and hidden shoals. During this period, Aguirre began to show the first signs of deep managerial suspicion. He saw conspiracies in every whisper and doubted the loyalty of his closest comrades. A system of total informant culture had entangled the ships, destroying the last remnants of trust among the exhausted men. The atmosphere of universal suspicion became unbearable, surpassing even the logistical difficulties in severity. The expedition moved forward by inertia, driven solely by fear of their leader and the law. The initial ambition to conquer territories gave way to a desire simply to escape these endless forests.
The plan for a large-scale conquests seemed increasingly fantastical against the backdrop of their dire reality.
Yet the dictator continued to stubbornly lead them toward this complex and dangerous strategic goal. The situation grew more tense with each passing day, bringing the moment of inevitable resolution closer. The expedition had reached a critical juncture on its grueling journey. If you enjoy our exploration of the hidden mechanisms of history, be sure to like this video. Your support helps us create even more historical documentary chronicles. This is what happens behind closed doors when ambition finally triumphs over common sense. The nominal leader, Fernando de Guzman, was quietly and irrevocably removed from any decision-making process. His disappearance from the expedition's political scene was the final chord in a carefully orchestrated maneuver. López de Aguirre officially proclaimed himself the sole commander and ruler of the new independent entity. This transfer of power was not accompanied by loud proclamations or open public debates. People simply woke up to a new reality where every word of the dictator carried the force of unquestionable law. Any dissent was now equated with treason and punished by immediate expulsion from the ranks of the expedition. Aguirre established a system in which his very presence instilled a paralyzing fear in his subordinates. The harshest rules of conduct were introduced, regulating every minute of life on the overcrowded ships. It was forbidden to gather in groups of more than 3 people, to have private conversations, or to disrupt the routine. The camp was plunged into an oppressive silence, broken only by the creaking of rigging and the sharp commands of the officers. The human collective had been reduced to a level of a passive and controlled clockwork mechanism. The expedition's logistics continued to deteriorate with every kilometer traveled down the river. The ships, built with such difficulty, proved unwieldy and constantly required complex repairs. The ocean was already close, but tidal waves and salt water made navigation extremely difficult. Using river water for drinking became impossible, which caused new daily hardships. A stop on the islands at the river's mouth became a necessary measure to assess the condition of the flotilla. Here it became absolutely clear that the original plan to seize territory from the sea was completely unfeasible. They had neither enough men nor reliable ships for such a large-scale amphibious operation. It was urgent to find a new, more realistic objective to ensure the survival of the entire detachment. The men looked anxiously at the boundless blue, realizing the enormous risks of the long journey ahead. The detachment was preparing to leave the safety of the continent's shores. The Rubicon had been crossed for good, and the way back was closed forever. Would they be able to cross the vast ocean in river flatboats? A severe test of their endurance lay ahead. Guess what happened next when they first encountered the Empire's regular forces? The exit into the open ocean became the moment of truth for the entire structure of the rebellious expedition. The river vessels, completely unsuited for ocean waves, instantly became uncontrollable in the currents. A violent storm scattered the ships across a vast expanse of water, destroying the fleet's communication and command system. The elements dealt the first crushing blow to the organized logistics of Aguirre's detachment. The dictator's flagship found itself completely isolated from the rest of the scattered fleet. Freshwater supplies on board ran out in the very first days due to the destruction of the barrels during severe pitching. The people found themselves trapped in a wooden box in the middle of an endless, salty desert with no clear landmarks. This was the very turning point when control of the situation was lost for good. A sudden shift in the wind saved them from disaster, steering the ship toward the shores of Margarita Island. The landing resembled not the triumphant arrival of conquerors, but the rescue of exhausted travelers. The men were glad to be on solid ground, temporarily forgetting their plans and internal political disagreements. However, this rescue was only the beginning of a new, even more dangerous strategic chapter. The island's governor, unaware of the newcomers' status, welcomed them as royal subjects in need of assistance. Aguirre immediately exploited this trust to regain control of the situation. He orchestrated a bloodless coup, taking the leadership of the thriving local colony hostage. The island instantly fell under the rebels' control, granting them access to vast reserves. Margarita Island turned into a fortified camp preparing for a protracted political standoff. Aguirre ordered the confiscation of all valuables and the requisitioning of local residents' ships to build a fleet. The inhabitants found themselves completely subject to the will of the invaders, deprived of any ability to resist. The expedition had transformed into an army dictating its harsh terms. The point of no return had been definitively and irrevocably crossed. Now their path lay only forward toward the mainland, where the army of the Spanish crown was already waiting for them. The scale of the conflict had gone beyond that of a local rebellion by explorers. The decisions made on the island set in motion a chain of irreversible historical events. What if the government doesn't want you to know how easily control systems break down? The stay on Margarita Island became a period of absolute dictatorship when Aguirre took his methods to the extreme. He established a regime in which the slightest suspicion of disloyalty led to a person's disappearance from the rolls. The island turned into a closed zone where fear became the primary instrument of state policy. Lope de Aguirre launched a massive purge within his own reorganized ranks. He got rid of anyone who remembered the old days or could pose a theoretical threat to his power. This suspicion deprived his unit of its most experienced and thoughtful commanding officers. Only blind executors remained, ready to carry out any order from their immediate superior. To keep tensions high, he constantly concocted fictitious conspiracies, forcing people to spy on one another. No one could feel safe, not even members of his elite personal guard. This system of mutual distrust ensured that subordinates would never be able to unite. Isolation within the vast collective became absolute and insurmountable. During this period, the dictator made a decision that definitively cemented his status as an independent ruler. He abandoned the old flag and ordered the creation of his own symbols for his army. This symbolic gesture was of immense importance in shaping the identity of his small band of followers. They severed all visual ties with the empire they had once loyally served. The ideology of the campaign took on overtly grandiose and populist traits. Aguirre began positioning himself as the liberator of new lands from the incompetence of government officials. He promised his supporters the creation of a new, just, and prosperous society under his leadership. This rhetoric resonated deeply with weary soldiers who had no other prospects. However, behind the facade of determination lay deep strategic and logistical vulnerabilities. They had neither allies nor reliable rear support, nor a clear plan of action after landing on the mainland. Their entire campaign was built on the element of surprise and the authority they had established on the island. It was a strategy lacking a solid foundation and long-term planning. Meanwhile, the forces of the empire were systematically gathering intelligence and preparing a response. News of the capture of Margarita reached the authorities, and the machinery of colonial administration began to mobilize. Troops were assembled, ships were outfitted, and the governors of neighboring provinces coordinated their actions. The noose around the rebellious island began to tighten imperceptibly with each passing day. How long could this illusion of omnipotence last in the face of a vast system? The forces of the two sides were utterly incomparable in the long run. And what would happen when the rebels finally landed on the mainland? Were they ready to face a real army? At the height of his rule on the island, Lope de Aguirre took an unprecedented diplomatic step. He dictated and sent an official letter to King Philip II of Spain. This was not an act of repentance, but a direct declaration of independence and a statement of his intentions. The document was striking for its legal precision and its utter disregard for the monarchical authorities of the time. In this letter, Aguirre detailed the reasons for his dissatisfaction, accusing the colonial administration of incompetence. He asserted that it was ordinary explorers who had expanded the empire's borders, while officials reaped the benefits. The text was filled with harsh criticism of the entire vast system of governing the new territories. It was the manifesto of a man who had decided to sever all ties with his state. The document was reproduced and distributed to various authorities to ensure maximum impact. Aguirre wanted his position to be known to all strata of colonial society. He hoped that the manifesto would provoke similar outcries in other distant provinces. It was an attempt to transform a local conflict into a large-scale political confrontation. Sending the letter marked a point of no return in both legal and political terms. If there had previously been a slim chance of a peaceful resolution, it had now vanished entirely. The Spanish bureaucratic machine set in motion the process of suppressing this openly declared insubordination. The letter formalized the detachment's status as enemies of the state. The historical value of this document is invaluable for understanding the political processes of that era. It reveals the crisis of the administrative system and the difficulties of controlling remote territories. The text of the letter is still studied today as a unique example of early documented separatism. It was a manifesto that forever enshrined one man's ambitions in history. Having completed the formalities, the expedition began preparations for a decisive logistical push. The fleet left Margarita Island and set course for the mainland. Ahead of them lay an inevitable clash with the combined forces of the official authorities. Illusions faded, giving way to the reality of a full-scale military conflict. The landing on the mainland near Borborata marked the beginning of the end for Lope de Aguirre's ambitious expedition. The settlement had been abandoned in advance by its inhabitants, who had taken all valuable supplies and equipment with them. The rebels entered the deserted city, finding themselves in unfamiliar territory without any spoils or essential supplies. This marked the first tactical success for the Spanish authorities, who had adopted a strategy of completely exhausting the enemy. Aguirre made a fateful decision, ordering the destruction of his own ships after the landing was complete. This move was intended to cut off any retreat routes for his men. He wanted to show his men that only victory and a push deeper into the continent lay ahead. However, under the circumstances, destroying the transport vessels proved to be a catastrophic logistical mistake. Left without ships, the force lost its main strength, speed and mobility. Now they were tied to the land and forced to move along difficult routes. The Spanish troops, on the other hand, retained full control of the sea, gaining the ability to deploy reinforcements. The rebels voluntarily deprived themselves of maneuverability in their confrontation with the regular army. During this period, the first mass desertions began from the camp of the exhausted rebels. Realizing the hopelessness of their situation, soldiers secretly slipped away, hoping to surrender to the authorities. Aguirre responded by tightening internal control, but the command structure was already breaking down. The leader's suspicion had reached its peak, paralyzing the work of the headquarters. He distrusted all his officers and made chaotic tactical decisions. Command of the detachment had devolved into contradictory orders and constant changes in the direction of the arduous march. The expedition's organizational capacity, which had once allowed for bold maneuvers, was completely exhausted. The group had turned into a disorganized column, losing strength with every passing hour. The colonial troops were in no hurry to engage in direct combat, preferring to block the roads. They occupied all key high ground and roads, gradually restricting the detachment's freedom of movement. The information vacuum weighed heavily on the rebels, who had no idea of the enemy's actions or plans. The strategic initiative had completely shifted to the Spanish administrative structures. The destruction of their own ships and a misjudgment of the situation led the detachment into a massive crisis. Decisions that seemed like strategic moves turned out to be fatal miscalculations by the leadership. The logic that had functioned in relative isolation collapsed upon encountering the reality of the vast continent. The outcome of this long standoff was entirely predetermined. The siege of Barquisimeto marked the final stage of a brilliantly executed campaign to isolate the rebellion. Spanish troops under the command of experienced officers methodically surrounded the city, cutting off its supplies. They avoided direct confrontations, preferring methodical psychological and organizational pressure. The goal was to completely dismantle the enemy's structure from within without unnecessary losses. The authorities employed a powerful psychological tactic, the promise of amnesty to all rank-and-file participants. Documents guaranteeing forgiveness in exchange for ceasing resistance were secretly delivered to the camp. This tactic proved incredibly effective, exploiting the lack of ideological cohesion within the unit. The promise of safety outweighed loyalty to the expedition leader. Aguirre's officers began openly discussing the possibility of an organized surrender. For the first time in a long while, the leader's orders were ignored or carried out with deliberate delay. The power vacuum that had once allowed Aguirre to rise to prominence was now forming around him. He was rapidly losing his last remaining leverage over the remnants of his army. In an attempt to turn the tide, Aguirre planned a maneuver to break through the siege ring. However, this plan failed even in the preparation stage due to the men's unwillingness to obey orders. The unit had completely lost its effectiveness, turning into a demoralized group. The leader found himself in complete isolation among his former loyal supporters. The Spanish command masterfully managed the situation, avoiding hasty moves and minimizing risks. They understood that time was on their side, as the city's last food supplies were running out. Each day of the siege brought a peaceful resolution closer without the need for large-scale operations. It was a clear victory of a systematic approach over chaos and disorganization. Aguirre, realizing the scale of what was happening, completely withdrew from the management processes. His plans to create a new structure had collapsed, leaving him utterly alone. He no longer issued orders or attempted to influence the departing people in any way. Reality had finally shattered all the ambitious projects of the past few months. The camp's infrastructure was completely paralyzed. Posts were abandoned and warehouses left open. The city was ready to come under the control of the authorities, and this process was absolutely irreversible. The mutiny ended not with a dramatic event, but with a quiet and systematic cessation of operations. The expedition structure ceased to exist. Royal troops entered Barquisimeto, methodically occupying key points and restoring control. The order and law of the empire returned to the streets where, until recently, the independent detachment had been based. The vast machinery of the state had suppressed the local disruption with maximum efficiency. All that remained was to formally document the end of this unprecedented campaign. Lope de Aguirre's end was devoid of drama and served as the logical conclusion to his administrative decisions. When representatives of the crown entered the residence, he accepted defeat as an inevitable fact. The man who had challenged the system met his end, having lost all support. The process of restoring the status quo was swift and uncompromising. The scale of the consequences of this expedition for the entire colonial apparatus was colossal. The authorities realized the real difficulty of controlling the emerging groups in the new territories. The rules for organizing missions were immediately revised, and logistical oversight was tightened. The era of autonomous explorers operating without supervision was rapidly coming to an end. The legend of El Dorado, which had been the primary motivation for the expedition, was transformed into a tool of state planning. Such initiatives were now strictly regulated and funded only after thorough analysis. The state monopolized the right to organize large-scale territorial research. The dream of the Golden City was finally subjected to strict bureaucratic rules. The history of this expedition became an important case study for official reports and analytical briefings. The leader's name was used as an example of the consequences of violating the chain of command and losing control. The administration used this precedent to demonstrate the importance of enforcing laws on the ground. Information about the event was carefully filtered to ensure the desired educational effect. The assessment of Aguirre's organizational abilities remains a subject of study for experts. He demonstrated a capacity for leadership in critical situations and an understanding of group psychology. However, his methods and lack of a long-term strategy led to the complete collapse of the entire structure. He demonstrated the potential of autocracy, but failed to ensure its viability. The journey, conceived as a commercial venture, turned into a complex social experiment under conditions of isolation. It demonstrated the importance of sustainable management systems and the risks of their deterioration without external oversight. This experience served as a warning to all organizers of large-scale autonomous projects. The group's survival depended directly on the quality of the administrative decisions made. And so the story of the craziest expedition in the Amazon has come to an end. What other historical mysteries and failed expeditions would you like to see in our next videos? Suggest your topics in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new exciting investigations.